now going to hear from Rebecca Homkes about better management, say UK jobs and boosted recovery. Rebecca is at the LSE Center for Economic Performance and World Management. She's involved in the Cambridge, Harvard, LSE, Stanford Measuring Management Practices Consortium.
It's a mouthful. All right, I've got about 10 minutes to talk about over a decade of research, over 10,000 firms, so I'm going to have to go pretty quickly through this. But when we talk about making the case for management, that's what we set out to do here. And talk about not just that management matters, but how much management could matter and explain the difference in performance across firms and within industries and across countries. And so, I put up here, some pictures of, perhaps some infamous managers. And the people in this room, I don't have to make a case. And the popular press has long talked about the importance of management. We think managers matter and how much how much I do on the job. But when we began this work, the hypothesis was, okay, yeah, managers matter, but what about management practices themselves? Could they actually go far in explaining differences in performance across organizations? Now, this is an area that economists had kind of long shied away from, and a big reason for this was the lack of systematic research. So we jumped in with the hypothesis that management could matter in explaining differences across firms. Now, there's a lot up here, and this is about the methodology, which I love, but I realize not everyone does. So real quick, here's how we did it. If you want to measure something, you have to start with creating a tool of how to do it. So what we began, we working in partnership with McKinsey, a consulting firm. We developed an organizational diagnostic tool which scored management across many dimensions, and I'll go back to that in just a second. We also started looking at manufacturing firms. Now, as we've expanded the research over the years to schools and hospitals and small software firms, however, we started in manufacturing because productivity, the performance aspect, was a bit easier to measure and compare across them. And also, manufacturing firms are a bit more homogeneous. So we can take manufacturing firms in Germany or southern US or in China, and we have the same set of processes that are going on. And we looked at medium-sized firms, so around 250 to 500 employees. We spoke with the plant managers in these organizations because they're close enough to the floor that they know what's going on, but they're still senior enough in the organization to understand the organizational dynamics. And it works. Instead of just mailing out a paper survey where people fill out, we know we're really bad at assessing our own performance and telling other people how we're doing. What we're really good at, especially if you're a plant manager at a manufacturing firm, is having a conversation about what goes on every day. So the grid, the scoring tool, is written as a conversation that we hold with these managers. So we bring in teams of MBA students, PhD students, and basically turn them into a call center. And they call up from London or wherever the country, managers and speaking their native language, hold a 45-minute conversation about what goes on every day, the management practices. Then it's a double-blind technique, which means that if I'm the analyst, I know nothing about the firm performance. Remember, we're speaking to relatively small firms, so they're not headline news. And the manager doesn't know he or she is being scored. They're having a conversation about management. And we also have obtained endorsements from the World Bank, central banks, employer associations, which we can send out. But in all honesty, guys, it works because students who are interested in that country, they're speaking their native language, they're talking to the managers. That's how you sell this thing. So real quickly, we can go back if there's questions. Look across 4 main areas of management: ops, monitoring, what goes on every day, tracking key performance indicators; target management, looking at goals, stretch goals, how we're actually tracking performance against them; and talent, or people management. Each of those buckets is broken down into 18 dimensions in total. Each of those 18 dimensions is scored on a 1 to 5 basis by the analyst, again, over this telephone conversation. So you end up with an overall management score for your organization. What we found, working with McKinsey and of course our analysts around the world, we have teams set up around the world, is that of close to 10,000 organizations, there are clear cross-country differences in management practices, where the US, Japan, and Germany are top performers implementing best practices, where some of other Southern European countries and our developing countries at the lower end of the grid. And what we really see here is these groupings of countries. So where the difference between Japan and Germany is not statistically significant, these 3 big groups, now that is statistically different. But the story is not this cross-country difference. The story, it goes on within countries. So over 80% of that difference in scores across countries is driven by what's going on inside the country. And if you take a look, I've highlighted just a few of them. The real thing is, it's not the story that all firms in India are bad. You know, if you look up there, there's actually a big chunk of firms within India scoring between the 4 and the 5 are best practices. The story is a huge chunk of firms with an average manager practice score of less than 2. Where if you look at the US, that tail is noticeably absent. There's something within the competitive environment driving those poorly managed firms out. Now the big story with the UK, which we don't have time to spend on today, is they do have that tail. So the driver of the difference between the UK and the US is not necessarily lack of best practice in the UK, it's that significant amount of manufacturing firms in this lower tail with poor management practices. So that's one thing, just looking across countries where the differences fall, and within country, again, where the story is. We found a few stylized factors, what we call drivers in management, that go far in explaining most of these differences. And the key ones, and this is not just in manufacturing, these same ones resonate in the hospitals, in secondary schools, in partnerships between private and public organizations, are competition, the impact of multinationals, who owns the firm, skills, and size. I want to talk a bit about ownership because this is a key driver, and it doesn't matter what country, what industry, who ultimately owns a firm really seems to matter. What we find is that firms that are owned by dispersed shareholders are best managed across countries, whereas publicly owned institutions are the poorest, generally down to their talent or their people management. But within the UK especially, the story is these family firms. Across countries, but notably within the UK, family-owned, family-managed firms have the worst management practices. Now, the differences there that family-owned, you can see in the third there, family-owned, non-family CEO actually performs roughly in line with dispersed shareholders. But it's this, you know, the effect of passing down the firm from generation to generation. The second thing we find besides firm ownership is the impact of multinationals. It doesn't matter where in the world that they're operating, multinationals are the best managed. So they're exhibiting their management practices across the world. Now, another key takeaway from this is it's not just that multinational itself, but the more multinationals located within a country, or more specifically within an area in the country, the higher the scores of the domestic firms there. So we're finding key examples of the spillover effect from multinationals coming in, locating, and the spread of management techniques and capabilities. So besides ownership and the impact of multinationals, another overriding finding, and again this is in manufacturing firms as well as healthcare and education, is that skills really matter. And again, we're just showing we're just saying correlations between the two. But in firms where more managers have a secondary or a college degree, university degree, are associated with much higher management scores than those firms with less. And this matters for workers as well as managers. So it's not just more managers with a degree, but there is also a significant impact of having more of the manufacturing workers have a degree as well. Now the UK has a lot of gains to be made here, because if you look at the UK versus its competitors, it has the lowest average percent of managers with a degree in the UK versus Canada, Ireland, the US, or many of its European peers. And if we go back to the beginning, why it matters, and I'm trying to go really quickly here, we saw, yes, we think we can measure management. Yes, we know that there's big differences in management across countries and across firms within the same country. We know a few of the things that explain it, mainly this ownership, multinationals, competition, and skills. But the takeaway, the so what, is that this management score, our assessed manager practice score, is very strongly correlated with multiple indicators of firm performance. And I have just a few of them up here. If we look at labor productivity, we look at return on capital, sales growth, all these overall performance and productivity figures. And it's not just in the UK and the US that we find this. In China, in India, in Latin America, in Africa, we're just starting to look at Nicaragua and South Africa. These indicators, our assessed management score, is very strongly correlated with these other indicators of firm performance. We're also just starting to build a longitudinal panel. So we have a large set of firms we sampled in 2004, 2006, 2008, and some again in 2010. And what we see is that this impact between management performance stays with them as we go over this. And those firms that have improved their management the most generally have a strong association with improvement performance as well. What we also find is that more poorly managed firms are much more likely to exit. So this strong management is not only associated with these indicators of firm performance we're seeing here, but less likelihood of exit as well. So in the cap-up, I know we spent the first part of the day talking about innovation. You know, we have it, it's relatively well studied. When it came to actually measuring management within firms, that was less so. You know, the big thing is that what we looked at here, again, is pulling it away from the manager into practices and processes, things you can assess. We do have an identified best practice. And then the impact is really great, because here's something that everyone in this room knows. These are set systems and practices and processes. But when they're in place within a firm, it can make a huge difference. So again, substantial inter-country variation. UK really lags compared to its peers. The main reason is due to this large tail of underperforming firms. We know that management could be improved. We know competition matters. We know tax policy matters. We know R&D matters. And we know really that skills matter. So, you know, just a few ideas. We know that the smallest firms, those between 100 and 300 employees, identify a lack of managers with the right skills as one of the biggest constraints to improving their management practices. So there's certainly an area to look. We also know that the impact of management education courses and facilities could have a dramatic impact in just getting these practices and information out. And also expanding the ability of human capital. So letting professionally, externally trained managers come into some of these smaller, family-owned firms could have a big impact. All right, I think that's it.
That's it.
That's it?
Great.
Oh,
Thanks,
that was it?
Rebecca.
Oh.
Right on schedule.
Right on
Thank you very
schedule,
much.
all right. I was waiting for the big question.